We're here with Rick Haney today. Rick, it's been a long time. You and I have had correspondence for quite a while, so it's really fantastic to be in your lab. Rick works for the ARS, and we're out in Temple, Texas. Rick, thanks so much for taking the time and spending time with us and showing us around your lab. Tell us a little bit about your background, Rick, before we kind of get to talk about the work you've done. Tell us a little bit about your academic background and how you got to be where you are today.
Well, it's kind of a interesting story. I was an auto mechanic. I did furniture upholstery. I did apartment management, and then I dropped out of college a year and a half after going to college. I went a year and a half in '77, dropped out, and worked. And I went back in the '80s and to finish my degree, and I was working full time.
Yes.
And boy, that was difficult. But I'd worked on farms most of my life.
Right.
And even in the '80s, up to the '80s and '90s, and so I came away wanting to help farmers.
Okay.
And we didn't have, my family didn't have any farms. They'd all been sold.
Yep.
And so I decided the best way I could do that was go get a degree.
Yes.
And soil testing. I was interested in soils, and soil testing was a really good way to reach that audience and help them. That's the way I could contribute.
Okay.
And so, I mean, I entered graduate school when I was 38, 39.
Okay. Yeah.
And so the unique position I'm in is I've been on both sides of the fence. I've been a farmer and working for farmers, right?
Yeah.
and then I've been in the academic world.
Yes.
Because I believe that if farmers had to go to graduate school and PhDs had to farm for a living, that we would be on the same page.
Okay,
we'd move forward.
Okay, yeah. Oh, that sounds pretty good. And how long have you been over at the ARS for then?
I've been here working for ARS for 11 years.
Okay. All right, well, that's a good segue. But one of the things that you and Will Brinton developed was this Haney-Brinton test of soil CO2 respiration. I have used it and have found it to be extremely helpful because especially with the CO2 burst, I can basically work it back to nitrogen. But before you tell me how it works, give me the story of how you and Will Brinton got around to developing this rather unusual and rather helpful test.
Well, I had been working here just a year or two.
Yes.
And they had a meeting, and I'd never traveled, hardly, and they had a meeting in Cancun, of all places. And it was a soil testing type focus, and so and my wife and I were just gotten married, and that was our honeymoon, basically, and we went down there, and Will Brinton had a poster showing this gel deal. And he was sick that day, the day that I went to the deal, and he didn't see my stuff. And so we were both at this meeting and never got together. But I read his poster and I thought, oh my, here, I have a method. He has the technology and I have the method. Because I knew that the method development was never going to be used if it wasn't quick and rapid. We were doing chemical titrations, and here's a way to get around that. So when we got back from the meeting, I called him and we talked for a long time and hit it off right away and saw the potential for what we were doing. And then we entered into an agreement called a CRADA with ARS and Woods End Laboratory in Solvita, and we just took off from there.
And that's how the Haney-Brinton test was developed.
Yep.
All right. If you think about it, if you start talking to farmers and you start talking about CO2 generation, how in the world does that come back down to available nitrogen? So give us the foundations of that, if you would.
Well, microbes are alive in the soil, and we've ignored that for a long time. Microbes take in O2 just like we do. We breathe in oxygen, and they breathe out CO2. Microbes do the same thing. The harder we work, the more CO2 we release. The harder they work, the more CO2 they release. It's a very similar thing.
Yes.
So back in graduate school in '94, we were looking at Alan Franzluber's was showing me this equation that he thought he developed about CO2. and soil respiration.
Yes.
He was doing 21, 24, 36 days incubation studies.
Yes.
And he thought, using some algorithms, because Alan's way smart, that he said, he brought me in, I'll never forget it, because he brought me in there and he said, I think we can do this quicker than a 3-week incubation based on this algorithm I've developed.
Got it. And so what was that? What variables was he looking at there?
He was just basically comparing, he's got these long-term CO2 evolution values, and he figured out that, okay, what if I look at day 3,
Yes.
day 1,
Yes.
so he could be on me.
Got it. Okay.
And so I said, I'll tell you what, I'll start measuring it. I'll start doing a 1-day CO2 and a 3-day CO2.
Yep.
And we'll see if what you think is right.
Yes.
And sure enough, it was. And so he kind of went off on a 3-day CO2 thing for microbial biomass estimates, and I went with the 1-day CO2 thing because I thought that was important somehow. Because we were shocked that you could take a soil and dry it and re-wet it, trap the CO2, and we kept seeing that these soils that had higher CO2 were more fertile soils because these were soils we knew.
Yes.
And this trend kept happening year
Okay.
after year after year, and it was like, it can't be this simple.
Okay, so at that stage you were seeing that CO2 generation, 24-hour or even 24-hour CO2 generation was in some way proportionate to soil fertility.
Correct. Okay. And then we were doing nitrogen mineralization studies alongside those. Then we started correlating 1-day CO2 with laboratory nitrogen mineralization in 3 or 4 weeks.
Yes.
And we saw these phenomenal relationships.
Yes.
And we were like, that can't be. The first paper I wrote
Yeah.
was showing that relationship, and
Yes.
plus that it had different amounts of dairy manure applied. I mean, the R-squareds were phenomenal. The relationships were phenomenal. And it was rejected. It was my first attempt at writing. It was my first attempt at publishing, and they just rejected it. And the reason was, and I'll never forget this, the guy said, you can't do that, that's too simple. That was what he said in his review.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do
Okay.
that, it's too simple.
It's too simple. Okay.
And I was like, what? Have you ever heard of E equals MC squared? That's a very
Real
simple.
Yeah.
But boy, that was really a rude awakening for me in academia, because it was like, I thought the data was what was important. It's not always about the data. People have preconceived ideas about what science is and what numbers mean.
Okay.
And sometimes their change is very, very difficult, I found, in science.
Right.
My career as a graduate student was the great disillusionment. When I started to understand what 1-day CO2 was doing and how these microbes, what they were trying to tell me,
Yes.
I thought, wow, in 3 or 4 years, everybody's going to be doing this test. Here we are 15 years later.
And so there's still a huge amount of inertia and resistance to this idea.
Sure.
Well, and we'll get to that. We'll get to the philosophizing part of it. But so now you have the Haney-Brinton soil CO2 test, and basically, I've been using it. What we're saying is the data allow us to fairly reliably project what our mineralizable nitrogen is going to be generated for this season.
Yes.
Based on soil CO2
Yeah. And it's a conservative estimate. That's an important thing to understand.
It's conservative.
It's
so
very
okay.
conservative. And we did that on purpose because
Yes.
we don't ever want to tell farmers, we don't ever want them to under-fertilize.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
we're not anti-fertilizer. We're
Right.
anti-too much fertilizer.
Yeah.
That's all.
Agreed.
You can't feed the world without fertilizer, I don't think.
Right.
But you know, that we want to be efficient. That's
Yep.
what this all is about, is
Yes.
efficiency. Not trying to step on anybody's toes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's be efficient with our natural resources.
Okay.
Let's be efficient with our science.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.